It began, as so many curious evenings in Oxford do, with a recital, the kind that seemed arranged more for the acoustics of the building than the pleasure of the audience. I had gone because there was nothing better to do, and because one must occasionally believe that beauty, properly rendered, might provide a reprieve from thought. Bach, they said on the program, though the name of the organist escaped me almost at once. The air inside All Souls Chapel was chill and faintly medicinal, the kind of cold that remembers candles. Outside, rain stitched its quiet thread through Radcliffe Square. Inside, a dozen or so of us sat scattered among the pews, elderly dons, students pretending to be moved, one or two widows dressed as if for remembrance. I found myself watching them more than listening. The music filled the vaulting, then faltered, as though the building itself drew breath. And that was when I noticed her, a woman in black, slender and still, seated near the side chapel beneath the memorial to some long-dead provost. Her hands were folded in her lap, though once or twice they moved slightly, as if tracing a memory in the air. There is a loneliness one recognizes instantly in others, perhaps because it mirrors one's own. She didn't turn when the last chord dissolved. She remained unmoved, even as the polite applause murmured and died. Only when the organist began his encore, a small, tender piece, not Bach at all, did she rise and slip away, her movement as deliberate as silence itself. When I left some minutes later, I saw her again across the quadrangle, the hem of her coat brushing against the cobblestones, her umbrella tilted like a question mark. Two fellows were standing under the portico, their heads inclined, voices low. I heard one say, "She's still at it," then the other reply, "You can't blame her, not after that business with the papers." It was nothing more than gossip, the natural language of colleges, but it lingered in my mind. The rain had become steady by then, and the lamps threw long pale halos across the stone. I walked without direction, past the warden's garden, along Cat Street, where the puddles caught the amber reflections of bicycles. Oxford at night has the manners of a ghost town, decorous, regretful, and entirely self-absorbed. Somewhere behind me the bells began to strike the hour, slow and grave, and for a reason I could not name I thought again of the woman's face. Not beautiful, but possessed of that particular symmetry grief sometimes grants, as though sorrow had polished every feature until only purpose remained. Later, at home, I poured a small measure of whiskey and sat by the window overlooking the misted roofs. Music, rain, memory. They have the same habit of repeating themselves when one least wishes them to. I tried to recall the melody she had risen to, but it escaped me. Instead, I found myself humming something entirely different, a line from a cantata I'd once loved, about forgiveness and light. There are moments when the mind mislays its own logic, and something purely irrational takes hold. A small insistence that what one has seen is connected to what one will soon discover. I told myself it was nonsense. Yet even as I undressed, I kept hearing the two dons' voices behind me, their tone half pitying, half conspiratorial, her husband's papers, the inquest that never quite ended. I went to bed with that phrase circling like an unanswered question. Papers, inquest, widow, words that could mean everything or nothing, depending on who arranged them. Sleep came fitfully. Once I dreamed of the chapel again, the pipes of the organ like tall, silent witnesses. A note sustained beyond its measure, vibrating faintly until the whole room seemed to listen. And beneath it all, a rhythm steady as breathing, the sound of bells marking time for someone who would not hear them again. When I woke, the rain had stopped, but the melody lingered. It would be some days before I discovered whose silence it belonged to. There are mornings when Oxford seems to begin reluctantly, as though the city itself were hung over from its own history. That morning was one of them. Grey, heavy, with a drizzle that could not quite decide whether to fall or hover. I had been rereading a passage of Hardy, something about regret being the only honest sentiment left to mankind, when Lewis arrived with his usual uneasy briskness. He carried a newspaper folded twice and already damp at the corners. He didn't say anything at first, just placed it on my desk and waited. I looked at the headline. Widow of All Souls, dawn reopens. Questions about husband's death. The name beneath it was one I recognized, though faintly. Professor Adrian Chiswell, drowned 5 years ago during one of those solitary punts scholars sometimes mistake for reflection. His widow, Eleanor, was calling for the inquest to be reopened. Evidence, she claimed, had been overlooked. I remember Lewis saying something about how the dead never rest in this town. The living won't let them. I told him to find the old file. He looked surprised, perhaps because I'd dismissed similar clippings a dozen times before. But something about that name, Chiswell, had settled uneasily in my mind. Not the man himself, whom I had never met, but the rhythm of it, the sort of name that belonged to the spines of obscure books or to footnotes read by no one. While he went to fetch the file, I remained at the window, watching the rain smear the faces of passers-by into anonymity. When Lewis returned, the folder looked tired, its label faded to near invisibility. Inside, the report was as brief as such reports tend to be. Middle-aged male, fellow of All Souls, drowned near the Cherwell Bridge. No sign of foul play. Blood alcohol moderate. Verdict, misadventure. There was even a photograph. A narrow punt moored against the bank, a hat floating some feet away. The image of order, disturbed only slightly as if death itself had been courteous enough not to make a scene. I read the pathologist's note twice. No defensive wounds, no water in the lungs. A curious phrase, that. He had died before the river took him. A seizure, perhaps. A fall. But the body had been found without bruises, without cause. I'd learned long ago that Oxford's rivers are full of such polite mysteries. They swallow without argument and keep their secrets under silt. Lewis asked whether I believed in the widow's claim. I said I didn't believe in anything until I'd had reason to disbelieve it. He muttered something about my fondness for ghosts. But there are worse affections than the desire to understand the past. I remembered, vaguely, an inquest I'd attended around that time. Perhaps even this one. A coroner reading his notes aloud with the detached compassion of a man who had long ceased to expect truth from the living. A woman in black seated alone, her head bowed but unbroken. I could see her even now, though the details had thinned with time. Perhaps that was why I agreed to see her, curiosity or some other indulgence of the mind masquerading as duty. Before leaving the office, I noticed the crossword at the back of the newspaper. Someone had already begun to fill it in. The previous days, no doubt. The clue that caught my eye read, Faithless Scholar's Confession, 7. The answer, apparently, was Betray. I smiled at the irony, the symmetry of coincidence. Then, without thinking, I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket. The rain had lightened into mist by the time I reached the quadrangle. Bells from a nearby chapel tolled noon, each strike blurring slightly into the next. I paused beneath the archway of All Souls, that perfect geometry of learning and loss, and thought how easily the years close over the most inconvenient truths. Later that evening, over a reluctant whiskey, I caught myself wondering whether the widow's insistence on reopening her husband's death was not about justice at all, but about memory, the refusal to let even sorrow be tidy. That was when I decided I would visit her. I've often thought since then that most of what we call investigation is only an attempt to keep the past from rewriting itself, and Oxford, of all places, has the best handwriting for such revisions. It was a peculiar feeling, walking again through the gates of All Souls, that most self-contained of Oxford's sanctuaries. Even after years of investigations within its cloisters, I could never quite escape the sense that it stood slightly apart from time, a place not of memory, but of selective remembrance. The porter at the gate greeted me with the bland civility peculiar to men who have seen too much of both privilege and scandal. He seemed to know why I was there before I spoke. He always did. They always do. The dead, it seems, never quite managed to leave the colleges that made them. Inside, the quadrangle lay, in its usual, impossible stillness. Gravel paths, cut with the precision of a compass, led to doors that all looked equally disinterested in visitors. The windows of the library reflected the sky like indifferent eyes. Somewhere a clock chimed. Not for the hour, but for its own satisfaction. I paused, listening, and thought of the drowned man who had once walked this same geometry of stone, unaware of how neatly the place would one day fold itself around his absence. The warden received me in an office lined with portraits so dull they might have been painted from the same face. He offered tea in the mild sort of sympathy reserved for bureaucratic inconveniences. I asked about Chiswell, a brilliant medievalist, yes. A touch eccentric, perhaps. Fond of music, solitude, and sherry in nearly equal measure. No enemies, none worth noting. A tragedy, yes, but quite without mystery. I nodded and let him speak, though I could feel his discomfort growing, not from guilt, but from the prospect of institutional embarrassment. Oxford fears scandal more than sin. He told me, with the air of a man disposing of clutter, that Chiswell's papers had been returned to the library years ago. I asked whether the college had ever examined them. The warden smiled in that tired way academics do when confronted with the idea of action. We're scholars, Inspector, not detectives. The line pleased him. It didn't please me. I left him to his conscience and made for the library, which breathed that particular fragrance of dust, vellum, and deferred ambition. A junior fellow, pale and eager, led me to Chiswell's old desk, a small cubicle facing the north window. There, beneath the brass lamp, the wood bore the faint imprint of a hand that must have rested there countless times. A few notes, catalogues, marginalia remained. Nothing remarkable, save for a single scrap of paper pinned under the inkwell. A Latin phrase written in Chiswell's unmistakable, cramped hand. Illa scit, she knows. The fellow, seeing my interest, tried to explain that Chiswell had often scribbled quotations from medieval sermons, fragments of manuscripts. I said nothing, but I read the phrase again. Not she knew, which might have been safely nostalgic. She knows. Present tense. It was a message, not a memory. Outside, the rain had begun again, thin as thread, falling across the courtyard with a persistence that felt deliberate. I stood beneath the arch and watched it gather in the stone channels. Oxford rain has the virtue of sounding like thought, persistent, repetitive, without resolution. A porter passed by, his cap tilted against the weather. He stopped when he saw me. Poor Professor Chiswell, he said softly. Used to sit in chapel every Friday evening, never missed a service. His widow still comes sometimes. Same seat, second pew from the left, never speaks to anyone. I thanked him and turned back toward the gate. But before leaving, I looked once more across the quadrangle. The windows shone faintly in the damp light. I had the curious impression that the college itself was listening. Not to me, but to what had been left unsaid within its walls. That night, back in my rooms, I wrote the Latin phrase on a slip of paper and placed it beside the day's crossword. 2 puzzles, equally silent. The clue that drew my eye again was still there. Faithless scholar's confession. I looked at it for a long while, tracing the symmetry of the letters, and felt a small, unnameable disturbance. She knows. Perhaps she did. But of what and why, the college preferred to forget. It was one of those afternoons when the air felt too still to belong to the living. The sky had not yet decided whether to rain, and the streets of Holywell seemed suspended between silence and confession. I remember walking past the music shop where a young man was tuning a violin, his bow drawing out a note so pure it made the glass hum. It followed me as I turned the corner, fading only when I reached the narrow house with ivy that had outlived several occupants. Eleanor Chiswell lived there, the widow of All Souls. She opened the door herself, no servant, no hesitation, as though she had been expecting me all along. She was dressed in the same black I remembered from the recital, though in the soft daylight it seemed less like mourning and more like armor. Her manner was formal, practiced. She spoke my name as though she had rehearsed it. I said I was looking into her late husband's death. Unofficially, I added, though we both knew there was no such thing. She led me into a small drawing room that smelled faintly of furniture polish and rain-soaked flowers. A piano stood in the corner, its lid half open, a single page of Schubert resting on the stand. She noticed my glance and said, "I play in the afternoons. It keeps the silence from growing too loud." I told her I understood, though I doubted she believed me. I asked about her letter to the coroner. She spoke calmly, but I could feel the careful strain beneath her words. "Adrian did not drown by accident," she said. "He was being blackmailed. There were papers, something to do with his research, that went missing before his death." She had received a note not long ago, unsigned, reminding her of them. I asked if she still had it. She shook her head. "It had been burnt," she said. "Too dangerous to keep." She poured sherry for us both. The decanter caught the light, refracting small amber shards across the room. Her hands were steady, but her eyes betrayed a fatigue deeper than grief, the weariness of someone who had held a secret too long. I asked what sort of research her husband had been conducting. She hesitated, then said it involved a lost manuscript from the 15th century, a codex of theological poems thought to have vanished from the All Souls Library centuries ago. Adrian had been convinced it survived. When he died, she told me, the only thing missing from his study was a locked folio. I asked if she had ever read his notes. She smiled faintly. My husband didn't share his discoveries, not even with me, but he shared his silences. That was enough to know when something had gone wrong. The piano caught my attention again. I moved closer, drawn less by curiosity than by the faint impression that something was out of place. The music on the stand, Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat, was marked in pencil, a phrase repeated 3 times in the margin. "Erinnere dich." Remember. I asked if it was her handwriting. She said no. When she spoke of the night of his death, her tone altered. Not grief, not guilt, but the kind of resignation that comes when one has already rehearsed a tragedy into routine. "He went to the river alone," she said. "He always did when he needed clarity. But that evening he was angry. Someone had sent a message. He never told me who." I asked one last question, whether she had ever been to the chapel since. Her eyes, until then composed, flickered. "Every Friday," she said, "the same pew. One must keep faith with something." As I rose to leave, she sat at the piano and began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, then steadier, tracing the outline of the melody I'd heard during the recital. Bach, I thought. No, not quite Bach. The phrasing was different, more personal, as though it were remembering rather than performing. I stood at the doorway and listened. The music followed me down the stairs, into the damp Oxford air. It was only when I reached the street that I realized the melody's final bar was incomplete. It stopped mid-phrase, unresolved. That night, unable to sleep, I found the crossword she had marked with her husband's name. One clue read, "Composer who forgot the ending, 5." I filled in the answer without thinking, B-I-C-H-S. It didn't fit, not by the rules. Yet somehow it felt right. The morning arrived pale and indifferent, as if Oxford itself were tired of remembering. I sat at my desk with a mug of coffee that had gone cold too quickly, staring at the newspaper Lewis had left for me. The Times, folded to the crossword. It was an old habit of his, this small, unconscious offering to my better moods. But today, the habit served another purpose. Somewhere inside the coroner's report, I had read of a crossword found in Chiswell's pocket on the night he drowned. Half completed, the rest soaked beyond legibility. The file had dismissed it as irrelevant, though that word has always struck me as dangerously confident. The clue had stayed in my mind. Faithless scholar's confession. 7. The answer. Betrayer. I wrote it out again, the pencil faint against the paper, and stared at the letters until they blurred. Something about it had felt wrong the first time I saw it, and now, looking again, I understood why. The structure of the clue didn't work. The definition fit, but the wordplay didn't. It wasn't the clue of a man solving a crossword. It was the work of someone trying to rewrite one. A correction, or perhaps a message, the kind of detail one doesn't notice until it begins to insist on being noticed. Lewis arrived, cheerful enough for 2 people. He had brought files, sandwiches, and an unshakable belief in reason. He said the widow had phoned again. She wished to thank me for taking an interest, though she hadn't asked for it. I said I would visit her later, and Lewis, sensing the futility of argument, shrugged and began to unwrap his sandwich. "There's something in a man's silence," he said between bites, "that makes women talk." I told him there's something in women's silences that makes men foolish. It was the closest thing to humor we managed that day. At noon, I walked down to the records office, a dim and airless room where even the light seemed to arrive reluctantly. I asked to see the All Souls faculty register from 5 years earlier. The clerk, a thin man with nicotine fingers, produced a leather-bound volume that smelled faintly of candle grease. I leafed through the pages until I found the year of Chiswell's death. There, between the lines of neat calligraphy, I saw it, his signature, written in his characteristic, almost apologetic hand. Beneath it, another name struck through and rewritten. The clerk glanced over my shoulder, uninvited, and muttered that errors were common in the old books. I nodded, but I took note of the name beneath the erasure. Weatherby, C. It wasn't much, just ink corrected over ink, but I have learned that Oxford's truths are rarely louder than whispers. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine as dust. I walked to the bridge where Chiswell's body had been found. The river was calm now, obedient, carrying its secrets downstream as though ashamed of them. I leaned against the railing, thinking of the widow's voice, her careful pauses, the way her eyes had drifted toward the piano when she spoke of her husband's last night. There had been something in her phrasing then. He went to the river alone, as he always did when he needed clarity. Not when he wanted to think, but when he needed clarity, a word chosen too precisely to be careless. Back at the office, I looked again at the crossword, tracing the letters of betrayer with my finger. If Chiswell hadn't written the clue himself, someone else had. Someone who knew his mind well enough to mimic it, but not his method. I flipped the paper over and noticed something on the reverse, an advertisement column, the kind I usually ignore. The ink had bled faintly through from where the crossword had been dampened. Only one word was still legible. Clarion. A name, perhaps. Or the echo of one. That night, as the city settled into its usual melancholy quiet, I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words in the margin. Note, name, misprint. They seemed harmless enough, but I felt the beginnings of a pattern. Something small and deliberate, like the opening bars of a piece whose ending I had heard once before, long ago, in another case, another loss. I poured myself a whiskey and listened to the rain. Outside, the bells of All Souls rang the hour. Each strike seemed slightly out of tune, as if the city were correcting itself and failing. It was only then I realized that the crossword, like the bells, had been altered by the same unseen hand. There is a certain light in Oxford when the afternoon falters, thin, porcelain, almost kind in its indecision. It was under that light I met Dr. Clara Weatherby, though the setting was less romantic than it sounds. A coffee room in Magdalen, the kind with chairs that look older than they are, and a smell of overboiled milk lingering between the pages of neglected newspapers. She was younger than I expected. Not a girl, but not yet immune to the self-consciousness of being watched. When she spoke, it was in sentences that seemed to have been proofread in her mind before release. She said she'd worked under Chiswell for 3 years. She said he was a man who made the world sound larger than it was, who believed manuscripts could outlive human deceit. But then she paused, as if to amend the statement, and added that he also had a gift for cruelty, the kind that hides behind civility and careful grammar. I asked whether she'd been close to him. The question, though simple, felt indecent the moment it left my mouth. She looked at me for a time, then said quietly that close was a word academics avoided. She preferred entangled. There was no melodrama in her voice, no bitterness, only fatigue and the sort of honesty that sounds rehearsed from too much silence. She admitted they had quarreled near the end. A paper they'd written together. His name would appear alone, hers would not. He called it an oversight. She called it theft. And then he drowned, she said, like someone removing himself from the argument. Her words unsettled me, though not for their content. I had heard variations of that confession before: ambition, betrayal, the soft violence of intellectual pride. What lingered was something smaller, a hesitation when she spoke of the night before his death. She said she'd seen him that evening in the quadrangle, walking toward the gate. I asked whether she'd spoken to him. She said no, then yes, then that she couldn't recall. The contradiction was so minor most would have let it pass. I didn't. Later, in the college office, I asked to see the gate-book, that small relic of Oxford's obsession with order. It recorded every entry, every departure, as though time itself could be domesticated by ink. And there it was, Weatherby, C. Signed in at 8:42 p.m. No record of departure. I showed it to the porter, who shrugged. "Happens all the time, sir. They forget to sign out." Perhaps she had, or perhaps she hadn't left. I thought of the river then, dark under the willows, a place where absence becomes effortless. I remembered Eleanor's phrasing. He went to the river alone. Such certainty is usually a confession in disguise. I returned to my rooms that night with a headache that wasn't quite physical. The radio murmured something about a concert in St. John's. Bach again, and the music drifted through the air like a thought unfinished. I poured a drink and opened the crossword. The clue I'd been puzzling over remained. Composer who forgot the ending. 5. I looked at it now and saw, perhaps for the first time, that it might not refer to music at all. The glass was half empty when Lewis knocked. He had a file under his arm and the look of someone rehearsing bad news. He said the Weatherby woman had been in touch. She wanted to confess. My first thought was that she had merely grown tired of ambiguity. Oxford does that to people, convinces them that clarity is the highest form of virtue. When she arrived the next morning, she was calm. She admitted forging a few of Chiswell's notes after his death. Small corrections, nothing of substance, meant to protect his reputation. She even confessed to altering the crossword. A gesture of remembrance, she called it. I listened, but something in her explanation refused to settle. It was too neat, too conveniently redemptive. As she left, she touched the back of the chair, a small, involuntary gesture, tender in its restraint. And I realized, not for the first time, that the living are far more careful with their lies than the dead ever were with the truth. That evening, I sat by the window again. Across the street, someone was playing the piano. The same melody, the same hesitation before the final bar. The tune faltered, unresolved. I wrote one word in my notebook. Entangled. Then, without thinking, I crossed it out. It was raining when the letter reached me. Or perhaps I only remember it that way because rain lends memory its proper texture. The envelope, brittle with age, had been found among the late Professor Chiswell's archived papers at the Bodleian. A junior librarian, pale with the sanctity of discovery, had telephoned to say she thought I might want to see it before it was catalogued. I did. One learns to recognize the weight of paper that has waited too long to be read. It was addressed in a hand that trembled slightly but still insisted on elegance. To my dearest E, no surname, no date. The ink had faded to that pale sepia that suggests not neglect, but reverence. I took it to a reading desk by the window, the kind that leans just enough to make one feel conspiratorial. Outside, the rain slid down the glass like deliberate thought. The letter began gently. The tone of a man apologizing without quite confessing. By the time you read this, it said, the truth will already have changed its mind about us. There were sentences about redemption, the nature of silence, and the futility of love that tries to rewrite the past. But it was the phrase near the end that caught me. The sin of omission will always outlive the sin of deceit. I read it twice, not for understanding, but because the rhythm pleased me. Enclosed was a small rubbing of an illuminated manuscript, a delicate design of gold leaf and Latin text, the colors strangely alive despite their age. One corner of the page had been torn away, as if to remove a name or symbol. It bore a fragment of verse, et lumen est memoriae eius, and light is her remembrance. I took the letter to the curator's office. He was one of those men whose sentences seem always to begin in the middle, as if life had started without him. He peered at the page through a magnifier, then nodded with the solemn pleasure of recognition. 15th century, probably, he said. A palimpsest. Something written over something older. Perhaps Chiswell was tracing what had been erased. He turned the rubbing slightly under the lamp. Beneath the Latin text, faint but legible, another line appeared in darker ink. Not medieval, but modern. She knows. The same phrase I'd found in Chiswell's old desk at All Souls. I felt then that peculiar stirring of logic and intuition that passes for deduction, that Chiswell's life had been lived as a dialogue between two texts, the one he showed the world and the one written beneath it. The curator, oblivious to my thoughts, mentioned that Mrs. Chiswell had donated her husband's papers to the library herself, years after his death. I asked whether she had seen this letter before. He thought not. It had been hidden among lecture notes, folded inside an unremarkable folder marked Miscellanea. He smiled when he said it, as though the word absolved everything. That evening I walked back through Radcliffe Square, the rain now a mist so fine it seemed to rise from the stones rather than fall upon them. The chapel bells at All Souls were striking 6. Their rhythm was measured, weary, as though the city itself were trying to remember something it had deliberately forgotten. In my flat, I spread the letter on the table beside a crossword I had left unfinished. One clue stared up at me. Missing piece of truth. 4. I hesitated, then filled in the answer. Part. It was too simple, too ordinary. But it fit. The whiskey I poured was weaker than I remembered. I read the letter again, my eyes drawn to the torn edge where the text had been removed. For a moment I thought I could see the outline of a name. Not written, but implied. The paper seemed to breathe. Or perhaps I did. There is a silence particular to rain at night, a sound that insists on meaning but offers none. I left the letter on the table and turned out the light. Somewhere below, a piano began to play, hesitant, searching, the same fragment of Schubert that had followed me since the chapel. I stood listening until the music stopped, and in the darkness that followed, I felt certain of only one thing, that every letter ever written is merely a rehearsal for confession. It is strange how truth, when finally offered, often arrives, too perfectly wrapped to be believed. That was how I felt when Clara Weatherby appeared in my office that grey morning, her composure intact, her voice unshaken. She said she wished to confess, and the word itself, confess, landed with the dull finality of punctuation. Lewis had fetched her from Magdalen, where she had been lecturing on Chaucer's Retractions, which seemed almost cruelly appropriate. She stood by the window while I found a pen that worked. She began with small sentences, as though testing the weight of each one before letting it go. She said she had forged a few of Chiswell's research notes after his death, just enough to make his final work seem complete. She had done it, she said, to preserve what was left of his reputation. He had been under pressure, grant deadlines, academic rivalries, whispers about plagiarism. She wanted to protect him from posthumous humiliation. Her explanation was almost moving in its modesty. Too modest. It felt like a story rehearsed in solitude, the kind people tell themselves to turn regret into virtue. I asked about the crossword, the one found in Chiswell's pocket, the altered clue. She looked down at her hands, at the faint ink stains along the fingers, and said that too had been her doing. A sentimental impulse, she called it. She had filled in the last answer after his death, betrayer, because it was his favorite word. It was then I felt it. That small, familiar flicker beneath the surface of conversation, when the words ceased to match their shadows. I asked why she had chosen betrayer and not betrayed. She smiled, and the answer came too quickly. Because every scholar betrays what they love. It was clever, elegant, and utterly false. When she left, Lewis leaned against the desk, arms folded. He said she seemed genuine enough. I told him sincerity was the most useful disguise of all. He frowned, as he often did when poetry interfered with procedure, and asked what I thought she was hiding. I said, perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. That evening I found myself outside the Chiswell house again. The rain had returned, patient as ever. The windows glowed faintly through the ivy, like thoughts refusing to extinguish. Eleanor Chiswell opened the door with the calm of someone who has already anticipated the intrusion. She invited me in before I spoke. The room was unchanged. The piano, the sherry decanter, the smell of flowers beginning to turn sweet with decay. She asked whether Clara had confessed. I said she had. There was a pause. Deliberate, precise. Then she said, I hope you believed her. It wasn't a question. We spoke for a while. Politely. As though the conversation were a ceremony we were both too civilized to abandon. I noticed her hands again, the way they rested lightly on the piano lid. She mentioned that her husband had once described Clara as a girl who copied without understanding. I wondered if she meant scholarship or affection. Before I left, she asked whether the police had found what they were looking for. I said the police seldom did. It was the rest of us who had to live with what was left. As I stepped into the hall, she added, almost absently, that she would not be going to the chapel that week. I've heard enough confessions for one lifetime. Back home, I opened the file again. The crossword stared back at me. The clue, faithless scholar's confession, 7, betrayer. If Clara had written it, she had chosen her mask well. Yet something in her phrasing earlier had snagged in my mind. She had said she wanted to preserve Chiswell's reputation, not his name. It was a small distinction, but names, I've learned, are the only part of the dead that still misbehave. Outside, the bells of All Souls began their slow lament. I poured a measure of whiskey and listened. Each toll seemed to correct the one before, as if the city itself were practicing repentance. I thought of both women, one confessing, the other forgiving, and wondered which had lied less. The rain thickened against the window. I turned out the light, but the melody of that half-finished Schubert still haunted the room. Some truths, I realized, never announce themselves. They only hum quietly in the dark until one learns to listen. It was at dinner that the truth began, as it so often does in Oxford, to reveal itself under the guise of conversation. All Souls was holding one of its termly gatherings, the kind of affair designed to remind its members that intellect, like good claret, improves with careful decanting. I had been invited by the warden, more out of politeness than enthusiasm, and had taken my place among men whose laughter seemed trained to echo off stone. The dining hall glowed with candlelight. Silver gleamed against damask. The scent of roast partridge mingled with the faint sweetness of polished wood. Across the table, I saw Eleanor Chiswell, the widow, seated between two fellows, both leaning toward her with that particular blend of reverence and curiosity reserved for tragedy. She looked as she always did, composed, graceful, untouched by pity. When she caught my gaze, she inclined her head slightly, the gesture neither welcome nor warning, merely acknowledgement. As the wine flowed, conversation turned to poetry, as it often does when men have run out of safer subjects. Someone misquoted Dawn, something about absence sharpening love, and laughter followed, polite but shallow. And then Eleanor spoke, her voice low enough to compel attention. She corrected the quotation. Not absence, she said, distance. Dawn wrote that distance, not absence, was the measure of faith. There was a murmur of agreement. Yet my mind caught on the word distance. I had read the same poem years ago and remembered the line differently. Dawn had written absence, not distance. It was a small error, easily forgiven, but the kind of slip that reveals what the speaker believes, rather than what the poet intended. After dinner, I found her alone in the antechamber, standing by the window, her glass untouched. The candles had burned low, their reflections trembling in the pane like thoughts one tries to dismiss. She asked if I had enjoyed the evening. I told her I rarely enjoyed anything that involved more than one glass of wine and one truth at a time. She smiled faintly and said, "Then you must be miserable here." It was then that I asked about the letter, the one discovered among her husband's papers. She didn't feign ignorance. Instead, she looked out at the quad, where the rain had begun to fall again, and said, "He wrote too many letters and sent too few." I asked if she had known about the missing manuscript. Her answer came almost as an afterthought. He said it would damn us both. There was a moment's silence, the kind that exists only between two people who both know more than they can afford to say. I asked whether she had ever read the letter to its end. She turned toward me, her expression as unreadable as the water streaking the glass, and said, "Some letters are written to be forgotten." When I returned home, I found Lewis waiting, nursing a pint that looked as though it had aged badly in his hand. He said they'd finished processing the evidence from the river. Chiswell's notebook, his wallet, and a corked half-bottle of wine recovered from the punt. I asked what kind. Lewis checked his notes. "Bordeaux," he said. 1962. I said nothing, but a memory surfaced. An old lecture in which Chiswell had argued that the truth, like wine, was rarely pure and never simple. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, though it suddenly tasted poor by comparison. I opened the notebook again, running my finger along the blurred ink. There, on the final page, was a word I had somehow missed before. Faint, half washed away. Clarion. It might have been a name or a warning, or simply the sound of the river echoing through the pen. Outside, the rain was persistent, the kind that insists upon confession. I thought again of Eleanor's misquotation, the substitution of distance for absence. Dawn had been speaking of lovers separated by faith. She perhaps of something closer to guilt. I imagined her correcting her husband's verse as she had corrected the past. Quietly, elegantly, irreversibly. Before I slept, I wrote one line in my notebook. Truth, like wine, grows cloudy when left uncorked too long. Then I turned out the light. In the silence that followed, I could still hear the faint echo of the bells, steady, deliberate, as though counting not the hour, but the distance between two confessions. It was nearly dusk when I returned to All Souls for the last time. The city was fading under a tired sky, the stone walls bruised with evening. The rain had stopped, though its ghost still clung to the cobbles. I remember the scent of wet leaves along the lane, the faint echo of footsteps that weren't mine. Oxford is full of such echoes, things repeated, things unresolved. The porter recognized me by now. He nodded without curiosity and said that Mrs. Chiswell had been seen entering the chapel an hour earlier. I thanked him and crossed the quad, where the puddles mirrored the windows like small, obedient lakes. Every step seemed to disturb the stillness, as though the college itself disapproved of disturbance. The chapel door was open. Inside, the air was thick with candle smoke and the faint perfume of damp hymn books. She sat where the porter had said, second pew from the left. Her hands were folded, not in prayer, but in a gesture of stillness. The light caught her profile, and for a moment she looked not mournful, but composed, as if grief were something she had rehearsed into poise. I stood beside her and waited. She did not look up, only said, "You've found what you came for." I told her I wasn't sure what that was. Truth, perhaps, or its shadow. She said that shadows were often kinder. We sat in silence for a while. The organ pipes loomed above us, tall and pale like sentinels awaiting their cue. I asked about the manuscript, the missing folio, the torn page, the coded phrase. She didn't feign surprise. She said Adrian had hidden it behind the organ's panel. She had watched him once, years ago, placing it there with the care of a man sealing away part of his conscience. When I asked why, she said simply, because it was meant for me. I told her about the rubbing we had found, the Latin verse, the corner torn away. Et lumen est memoriae eius. Light is her remembrance. She closed her eyes. He always preferred light to forgiveness, she said. It was easier to believe in. Then she began, quietly, without preamble. They had argued that night, not for the first time, not for the last. He had confessed the affair with Clara, not in guilt, but in exhaustion. He wanted to end it, she said, though the words sounded less like an ending and more like a reprieve. She followed him to the river to make him listen. He wouldn't. Words became gestures. Gestures became accident. He slipped, struck his head, fell into the water. She said it with the composure of someone describing a dream that had already been dreamt too often. I asked why she had written the letter to the coroner, why she had disturbed the quiet of his verdict after so many years. Because guilt is an unfaithful companion, she said. It keeps returning. Her confession didn't feel like resolution. It never does. There was no triumph in her tone, no relief, only fatigue. I thought of the forged crossword, the altered clues, the small corrections that tried to tidy grief into order. Oxford is built on such corrections, one generation editing the last. When she finished, I told her she would need to make a formal statement. She nodded, as if she had already known this, as if she had been waiting for it. She said she wanted to go home first, to dress properly. Her dignity, it seemed, had survived everything else. As I left, the bells began to toll. Their sound filled the chapel, slow and exact, as though measuring the distance between one lie and another. The candles flickered in their holders, and for a moment the air trembled. I turned back once and saw her standing beside the pew, her hand resting on the piano lid near the wall. She touched it lightly, the way one touches a memory that still burns. Outside, the quadrangle was drenched in that uncertain light that comes after confession. Lewis was waiting near the gate, his collar turned up against the chill. He asked if it was over. I told him nothing in Oxford ever ends. It simply becomes a footnote. He frowned, not out of disagreement, but incomprehension, and we walked on without speaking. Later, in my rooms, I poured a whiskey and left it untouched. The river's surface returned to me. Black, unbroken, indifferent. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. She knew. It was the same phrase Chiswell had written in his desk years before. The symmetry of it was almost unbearable. The bells of All Souls struck midnight as I closed the file. Rain began again, soft and insistent, tapping the glass with the patience of confession. I sat listening, waiting for the sound to change, but it never did. Perhaps truth, I thought, is nothing more than water finding its level. And perhaps, in the end, that is all justice ever amounts to, the quiet return of what has long been submerged. It was some days later when I walked down to the river again. The mornings had turned colder, and the city wore its November damp like an old coat. The willow branches leaned closer to the water now, their reflections trembling in the current, as though unwilling to be whole. A heron stood motionless on the far bank, and for a moment I envied its certainty, that still, wordless watchfulness untroubled by memory. The trial, if one could call it that, had been mercifully brief. The facts, or what passed for them, lay flat and bloodless on the record, a quarrel, a fall, a river that kept its silence. Eleanor Chiswell had confessed enough to satisfy the law, and the law, as always, was relieved to close its book. Lewis told me afterwards that she had requested no visitors. He seemed almost disappointed, as though he had hoped to find one pure thing in all that tangle of motives. I said that purity, like innocence, is merely a question of distance. In the evenings I found myself drifting through the streets without purpose, drawn by habit more than intention. Oxford after rain is a melancholy companion, the lamps reflected in the wet pavements, the faint scent of old stone breathing through the mist. Once, passing All Souls, I thought I heard the piano again, that same unfinished Schubert she used to play. But when I stopped, there was only the wind. Back at my flat, I opened the folder one last time. The crossword lay inside, its edges yellowed now. The ink bled faintly where river water had once found it. Faithless, Scholar's Confession, Canto 7. I traced the letters with my thumb. Betrayer. I wondered who it had really named. Chiswell, his wife, or all of us who mistake love for understanding. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps it never had. I poured a measure of whiskey and left it untouched on the table. The sound of the river seemed to fill the room, though the window was closed. I thought of Eleanor, of her composure, the way she had touched the piano that last evening. Not as a player, but as someone bidding farewell to the only instrument that had ever answered her honestly. There was a kind of grace in that gesture, the grace of surrender. Lewis stopped by once, awkward with sympathy. He said the papers were calling it the Widow of All Souls case. I told him that Oxford had always loved a good epitaph. He laughed, though without conviction, and soon found a reason to leave. When the door closed behind him, I realized how much the city depends on such ordinary kindness. A man who means well, a silence kept out of respect rather than fear. Later that night I walked again, past the chapel, past the square where the bells hung quiet. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. I stood by the river's edge until the cold reached my bones. Somewhere, beneath that black surface, lay the sum of it all. Truth, accident, guilt, love, blurred together in the way that water blurs everything it touches. I dropped a pebble into the current and watched the ripples spread, widening, then fading. It seemed a small human gesture of acknowledgement, an echo without expectation. When I turned to go, the bells began to toll, slow and deliberate, their sound traveling across the water like a voice calling to no one. I listened until the last note dissolved into the air, and then there was only the river again, steady, indifferent, still speaking in the language it had always known, the language of forgetting.